This is the Kratom Science Journal Club with Dr. Jonathan Cachat. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for KratomScience.com. Each episode, Dr. Cachat and I talk about a peer-reviewed study published in a science journal. This week, we talk about patterns and reasons for kratom use among current and former opioid polydrug users, published in the March 2020 edition of Journal of Ethnopharmacology. Lead author and Kratom Science Podcast guest, Darshan Singh.
So I didn't realize at first he was a researcher that's in Malaysia, right?
Yeah.
And he's working with, it seems to be some University of Florida medicinal chemistry and pharmaceutics, so people out of the College of Pharmacy. So it was nice to see that there's overlap there. You know, I'd be curious, I didn't see anywhere really in the paper but like a funding disclosure, but if I had to guess, because of the association with, here we go, no conflicts of interest, because of the association with University of Florida, it's likely that these studies are funded by the NIH to some extent, National Institutes of Health.
Yeah. And I know, I mean, since this is a recent one, they might be getting some NIDA, because they got a couple of grants at University of Florida. And, yeah, Christopher McCurdy was on that. He's one of the bigger kratom ones here in the United States. And I think University of Florida and that University of Science in Malaysia are the two that I see the most come up with the kratom studies. Yeah.
But, you know, and I think that he offered, Dr. Singh in this paper and in the episode, offered an alternative look at, and it's, you know, this is more or less a sociology study. You know, it's a survey that they collected, and the data is self-reported, and where you get into sort of the pros and cons of that. But I like to be able to see this type of research in another country where there's a history there, and there's also social dynamics at play, but it's different than the U.S. and it's different than, you know, it's different than any other sort of country or state, right? If you get more results from multiple locations where the cultural, economic, language factors are different, it's a good way to sort of get through the noise of what could be, a self-reported survey type study where, you know, people, it's a joke in like Psych 101 where, we know a lot about college age white people because those are the people who are on college campuses and can volunteer themselves for all these studies that, you know, beginning psychiatrists or psychologists are able to do. But we don't acknowledge, don't acknowledge that very much, that we need a real bigger representative of the sample population. So I thought it was cool to see it and to hear him talk about it from that perspective. From that angle, I thought the episode last week was great.
And he mentioned, I mean, that might have been one of the drawbacks of the study because there's some pretty stiff penalties in Malaysia for drug trafficking to an extent is sometimes punishable by capital punishment there.
Right.
And so
right.
Some of the two sample groups in this one was current poly-opioid users and former. Well, some of the former ones might have been lying because I think they even mentioned it in the study because of, they're afraid of legal ramifications. And he even addressed that in the podcast as well.
Yeah. No, that was a real good part in that why should we let this guy who's ostensibly a foreigner or a stranger, right? But they don't know him. Why should they let him into their social circle when, they're getting relief and they don't want to lose their supply and they don't want to go to jail? It's, certainly an issue with misguided and sort of or racist or socially based drug policy rather than scientifically based drug policy where, I appreciate too that he brought up the alcohol withdrawal is far worse. Heroin withdrawal is far worse. Like benzodiazepine withdrawal is far worse. And he made an adequate comparison that I make sometimes to people when I'm talking to them about coffee. It's more or less on the, scale of a good caffeine, dependence, where people are functional, but they're not if they go without it for a day, they're not going to, freak out and need medical attention, both physically and psychologically, but, that they'll make it, and it can be used properly in that way.
The population he studied, so it was 204 opioid polydrug users, and 142 current and 62 former. And it said that they were from the northern peninsula, so they were from like the rural areas. And one of the things he mentioned was they do have methadone programs there in Malaysia, but he said, it's a travel expense. They have to come into the city to do it. People are getting arrested outside of methadone clinics because just the policing there. And so Kratom is kind of it's kind of like they have no other choice type of thing, and they can get it there. I think especially because like northern Malaysia would be close to southern Thailand, so it's all grown there, and it's like one of those things. I mean, a lot of people use Kratom in the United States because they have no other choice, or they can't afford the medical care for other treatments, or they just don't want to get addicted to whatever buprenorphine or Suboxone or whatever's offered. So that's exactly
what I was thinking. I mean, it's not all that different from the United States. Like the hurdles one must go through to get quote unquote the like proper treatment, right? And then on top of that, aside from the travel logistics, aside from just finding a doctor, because I mean it's they keep clamps on it as tight as they're keeping clamps on abortion, right? So finding a doctor that's allowed to, then getting there regularly, then you get drug tested. If you were going to use medical cannabis, even in a state that's legal, they'll say, this is probably drug use, you're off the program, goodbye, like as in right now, not we're going to give you 3 more days or something, or, not, there's no compassion there. And from a harm reduction perspective, it just, it can be infuriating.
Patterns and reasons for Kratom use among current and former opioid polydrug users, and the reasons are pretty much right in line with the stuff we've heard, which is mostly to mitigate opioid use and withdrawal, and that's mostly the comments we got. Sometimes it's for it says euphoric, but I think that's mostly mood boosting. It's not like euphoric, like getting high type thing. It's like a mood booster, and so that was one of the reasons. And it said psychological problems, which a lot of people here would say anxiety and depression. That was one of the, but mainly it's for to stay off drugs or to help with withdrawals. And he even mentioned methamphetamine, it helps.
Yeah, that was interesting. I mean, there are points in which we start talking about Kratom, and if we continue this journal club, and so this is a survey-based use study. But if we get into like any pharmacology or psychopharmacology, like kinetics, the real answer is there's 100+ compounds unique to this tree, this Kratom tree, and we don't know what all of them do. They haven't been characterized. And there's certainly, I think the idea of an entourage effect in cannabis has, generally understood that, consuming the cannabinoids together with the terpenes produces effects that it wouldn't if you were just to consume one in isolation. I would assume that the same thing's going on with Kratom, but we have a lot of analytical chemistry, pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamic studies that still need to be done, that may reveal, to a certain extent that there is something with amphetamine-like stimulants that it's, really just calming yourself down, getting the anxiety sort of out of the forefront of your brain would be a good way, to deal with that psychologically. But there might be something physiologically going on that we just don't know yet.
Well, it talked about like mitragynine's the main one, and in most of the studies, the other thing we hear about is 7-hydroxymitragynine, which is the more opiate-like effect. But the interesting thing I saw, it said The mitragynine content differs with different types of leaves and how they are ingested. It has been reported that while mitragynine content is roughly 12% in leaves commonly found in Malaysia, it could go up to 66% in leaves found in Thailand, which is quite a difference.
Huge difference. Yeah, I mean, I thought about like really frosty cannabis plants, ones that are just like super, super sticky,
Christmas
just because
buds.
it's it's so much. But I don't think kratom doesn't have trichomes or sticky resinous glands like the cannabis plant does. So it's interesting to sort of think, what does a leaf with 66% content look like, and was it an analytical chemistry error? But yeah, that caught my eye as well. Like, holy moly, that's pretty high.
This other study, it just came out last year. It showed that actually mitragynine is actually metabolized into 7-hydroxymitragynine. It was just one study, but which is interesting, and that seems to be where, because 7-hydroxo is kind of a minor alkaloid. They never come up like the other alkaloids never come up in studies. He was also saying in the podcast, Dr. Singh I was like, well, have you ever heard of hair loss or liver problems? He's like all this stuff I hear from the United States, but not here in Malaysia, where we're getting it naturally off the trees. And he mentioned that the Kratom Consumer Protection Act would take care of that, because you would at least have to list the alkaloid content and what you're selling.
Right. Yeah. And so that was sort of that sort of is at the crutch of what I was mentioning, how it's good to see this type of survey-based research. And plus, with close to 300 people, it's pretty statistically valid. And there's pros and cons to every type of study, right? So it's just good to know those. But he basically said, look, I'm seeing these headlines come out of the U.S. where an ER doctor group, is writing about psychoses or mania and liver damage and all of this stuff being related to kratom. And they're not seeing that there. And, without a study like this, without someone like Dr. Singh, who's doing an empirical, survey, doing the statistics, getting the numbers up there, we wouldn't be able to make that, claim to essentially say this is, we're probably looking at blaming the wrong thing. Causation, or correlation doesn't equal causation, but there are these symptoms are not seen in other populations around the world using similar amounts of kratom for the same reasons. And then, then therefore we can engage in a productive conversation with some of the, the anti-kratom sort of pseudoscience that's being used and shuffled around different health departments to try to get it into Schedule I, which would just be, a tragedy.
I've noticed in Mississippi, because I was following Mississippi for a while, I had a lady who I was corresponding with who's really active in Mississippi, and they were going, the people who want to prohibit it in Mississippi are all law enforcement, which is problematic for one thing, but they were going around saying, oh, it's 13 times more powerful than morphine, but they were talking about 7-hydroxymitragynine, and powerful doesn't mean you're going to OD.
Yeah. Well, and so, I highlighted this section. It's interesting to chat about. So when they say higher potency than morphine, so, this is a 2004 study that is cited in the introduction of the Singh paper that was published in 2020 that we're going through.
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
Binding affinity doesn't necessarily correlate to strength of effects. And there's also potency behaviorally, at a behavioral level, right? So you can say this binds to this molecule stronger. It's like a stronger magnet. But that doesn't always necessarily mean that psychologically or behaviorally, physically, you're actually feeling, like it corresponds to a true, stronger feeling of the drug having activity. It's different levels of analysis. And when you look at binding affinity from an analytical chemistry perspective or pharmacokinetic perspective, you're typically looking at like a mu-opiate receptor that's been isolated and put into some tissue, usually pig ileum or a piece of small pig intestine, and you're measuring the electrical current on the neuron with a patch clamp. So you're measuring the difference across the bilipid membrane, and and you're washing the ileum in that compound and you're watching how much it decreases, the electrical current decreases or increases, it doesn't speak to the resultant behavioral or psychological effects by any means. One of the things that I didn't realize, though, just on this section again, real quick, Mitragyna does not recruit beta-arrestin 2 mediated pathways upon receptor activation and is considered a safer analgesic to classic opioids. So there was a lot of hullabaloo about the FDA or the DEA putting out a study that said, well, this binds to the opiate receptor, the mu opiate receptor, which is one of 3 opiate receptors. And there's others, of course, that are just called opiate-like receptors that haven't been characterized. But they said, well, it binds there. This is what it is. We're done here. Let's make it Schedule 1. That was reckless because something like, okay, so they're saying Mitragyna, when it binds to the mu opiate receptors or it blocks out molecules on the kappa or delta opiate receptors, it doesn't recruit beta-2 arrestin-mediated pathways. So when the compounds bind to the receptor on the neural membrane, it can recruit other proteins to that receptor and initiate signaling pathways all the way down to DNA expression or just, have them start building compounds or stuff. The beta-2 arrestin pathway is a G-coupled protein receptor pathway that leads to changes in the amount of receptors in the synaptic cleft. So the way tolerance develops in opioids, and by the way, tolerance is not the same across the board in a molecular perspective or a behavioral psychological perspective. Typically, you activate a receptor and you're continually activating this receptor, and the neurons are essentially like, this receptor is too activated. We're being exposed to a consistently higher quality or quantity of these compounds. I need to pull some of the receptor pathways out of the synapse. So it's reducing the density of opiate receptors at the synaptic cleft where communication between neurons occurs. So without beta-2 arrestin-mediated pathways being activated, it's not initiating the intake of receptors out of the synapse back into the neuron, which would then lead to a tolerance or having to take more of the compound to get the same pathway. So Mitragyna does not do that. They said 7-hydroxymitragyna does have reported to exert actions on the beta-2 arrestin-mediated pathways to produce undesired effects such as tolerance and cross-tolerance to morphine. That cross-tolerance to morphine is another important indicator of potential abuse potential or potential addiction potential. So the 7-hydroxymitragyna does do that. The mitragyna doesn't do that. There are 100 other compounds that we don't know about that are could be involved in all sorts of other signaling pathways. But I wasn't knowledgeable on the fact that it doesn't initiate receptor pull downs out of the synaptic cleft via the beta-2 arrestin 2 pathway. Mitragyna doesn't. So it was interesting to realize that, and it's basically just now a road sign that's saying like there's something more down here. We should investigate this further. But at this point, this 2016 study said that it didn't.
It's interesting that they had they divided people who use kratom for less than 6 years and greater than 6 years, and they all used about the same amount. So what you were saying about it making you want to use more of the drug doesn't really exist there.
Yes, it doesn't seem that over time, the ones that are using it more often. So most, so it's 106 less than 6 years, 98 more than 6 years. So it's pretty 50-50. And it doesn't seem that continued use over the course of years leads to a dramatic increase in the amount of drug consumed that you would see certainly in opiates. And, I think this is sort of harkening back to what I was mentioning on our first discussion together about a slow burn-on method of administration.
Yeah.
Taking it as a juice or taking it as a leaf compound, you are not taking the sort of pure, isolated 99.9% pure mitragyna, through whatever method of administration you want. And I think that goes a long way who knows if tolerance would develop as fast as it does with Oxycontin if one were to consume like powdered mitragynine. We just don't know yet. And it speaks to the sort of the benefits. And I think a lot of the users in the US and in Thailand and Malaysia, there's an aspect of wanting to just sort of take care of yourself, right? So like a preference for taking your own therapeutic use or your own approach to removing yourself from drug addiction, where you don't get the looking down on you, or you're an addict, or all of the sort of like social baggage that comes with trying to get help for a problem that has been characterized as a criminal justice problem, but truly is a medical issue. And keeping, consuming kratom and keeping it in its natural form, whether you take the leaves and make a tea, or you're taking just the leaves in capsules, or you're doing the toss and wash method that I read so much about, but I won't dare to do myself just because I'm scared of coughing up all that powder. There's benefit to that, and I think it's several fold.
Yeah, and we even talked about his study about social functioning, and even in this study it said kratom users, quote, continue to work and function usefully in society as opposed to long-term users of opioids. And they even stay away from HIV risk behaviors, which is another social science study that Dr. Singh did.
Yeah.
And it basically, like, functionally, it's because you don't have to have kratom every 6 hours or you'll get violently ill. It's more like coffee. And they even said kratom can cause severe dependence in this study, but then it said so can tobacco and alcohol. As an alternative to opioids, it's definitely preferable.
And that's what I think about too as well. It's like you wake up, you make your coffee or you brew your kratom tea, and you're sitting there thinking about what you need to get done that day, right? So like I did that and printed out the study that we're talking about now and sort of planned the whole day. Being addicted to Oxycontin or heroin or even hydrocodone, you're really not even capable of thinking about what your plan is for the day until you get that need satiated and taken care of. And that's where a lot of people can get in trouble.
There's kind of a stigma around drug addiction, and that's why a lot of people don't go to get help to maybe like NA or AA, because they're kind of embarrassed to stand up in front of a group. I interviewed for this podcast Jennifer Van Blunk from Philly, and she got an injury in the Navy, and she just never was a drug user, and she got hooked on opiates for 10 years. And she said the thing with kratom is you can do that privately by yourself in your house, and you can use it as a tool to wean off opiates, and you don't have to go stand in front of strangers and tell your personal story, and there's none of that associated with it.
Well, just going to the doctor's office. I've been in pain management doctors' offices where they have printed out signs on every wall that's like, no early refills. If we find anything in your system, you will be cut off. Like, it's just, and maybe for good reason because of where we went with the opiate epidemic in this country. But like, no one's proud to be an opiate user, and everyone's just sort of trying to make it through that. Just going to the doctor's office, you just sort of have to succumb to this. There's a problem with you, and maybe we'll fix it for you if you comply with all of our rules and laws. And it can just, I know, there is one thing about like sort of being embarrassed or saying things in front of people. I want to talk on that right after this, but there's also just, I don't want to be associated with the stigma and have to carry around the weight and have to feel like a drug addict just trying to go to a doctor's office, then to a pharmacy in order to take care of, this injury that I have, or now this addiction that has developed because of that injury. But I will say, for Narcotics Anonymous, for Alcoholics Anonymous, it's really being able to go in front of other people, share your story, but perhaps more importantly, share your story with people who understand that story, and they're like, oh, you think that's bad? I did this when I was in the the depths of my addiction, there is a very powerful component to that social factor that just realizing you're not the only one, and that, other people, in fact, a lot of other people have had the same thought of taking their grandmother's, wedding ring to go get money, to go get more drugs. It's just often, I have to remind myself, and I often try to remind people, you're not that unique. If you're feeling this way, there are thousands of other people who also feel this way. And there's some solace in that realization or reminder.
Yeah. And I think community is important too. And a lot of people tell me, I was addicted to opiates, and then I found Kratom, and then I found this Kratom community and we have a purpose. We want to all keep it legal. And it's like that gave me a purpose too. And I'm like, and like a lot of people join a church or something like that. And I think, that's definitely important in recovery, not to discount that. But some people tell me, I don't want to do, the recovery. The Kratom helped me that I could do it privately. A few people tell me that.
Yeah. Oh, no, and I can totally understand that. To each their own, right?
Yeah.
Anything to get you out of the grip of, the devil's candy of opiates, especially pure pharmaceutical grade opiates, is a step in the right direction. And, often too, I've run into or even just like trying to quit tobacco addiction, right? When they have to make the decision for themselves, and then they have to continue with that decision the best they can, but relapse is likely. And it doesn't mean you're a failure. You're with most people that try to go through this process. You get knocked off the horse, you get back on the horse. But for anyone out there trying to help a loved one off of some sort of addiction, when they relapse, don't, come down on them and tell them, oh, you blew up everything you've just done. You said you were going to quit. You're a horrible person. It's like, they're just people, and they're trying to make it through. And the more support you can give, especially during a relapse episode, the better, the more likely they are. That community factor is certainly something that, is very important in a number for our species in general.
But another thing that interesting about this study was we hear a lot about like maybe from coroner's reports or something that like the extreme is Kratom caused his death, and he also had fentanyl in the system, and they ignore the fentanyl. But then the next thing they say is it's a mixture of drugs. The Kratom made it worse. But what Dr. Singh told me, and what's in the study, is these are poly drug users that are also using Kratom. And so I asked Dr. Singh, is there a danger of using Kratom with, when you're an opioid addict? And he said, no, I've never seen it. He's like, maybe just in the, just where there's adulterated Kratom. Not to like encourage people to take a whole bunch of Kratom if they're on heroin right now. I mean, I've even written it might be best to try to taper down as much as you can. But he, with the tea and with the fresh Kratom, it seems like sometimes if they can't get heroin at the end of the day, they'll drink a couple of glasses of Kratom tea, and it'll mitigate the withdrawal effects.
Certainly, yeah. We haven't seen clinically a very clear-cut relationship like there would be, let's say, taking opiates, taking benzodiazepines, taking alcohol. Like that's the overdose trifecta right there. I mean, we know that will cause respiratory depression to a degree that you most likely could overdose and die or something like that. Okay. But that clear-cut relationship hasn't been found. Yes, Kratom can be in the system, but all that depends on when it was taken, were they really taken together, and frankly, I thought you brought up a really good point, and it's highlighted in this study as well. And Dr. Singh essentially said, I've never seen it. This idea that someone starts on Kratom and then moves towards harder drugs, it's, again, just not clinically there. Most people that have decided to make the switch to Kratom are doing so for a specific reason to get off of whatever was the whether it was methamphetamine, whether it was alcohol, whether it was pharmaceutical opiates. Most people are going that way, and most people don't start with Kratom. It's really, it's the same way I found about Kratom, but like you find out about it in the search for a manageable and valid therapeutically assisted way out of opiate addiction. And we just don't see people going the other way. And I think that's, especially important to mention. We haven't heard gateway kratom theories yet in the U.S., but you better believe we will. And so by having these studies in other countries, in other populations where that's not the case, does a better job at painting an objective picture of what's actually going on.
And I had that as a note too. It seems like the opposite. Of course, like the gateway drug thing's right out of the playbook, but of prohibition. But right. In this study, it's their first use of any drugs was at 20, and their first use of kratom was at 26. I think most people that I've talked to, they started using drugs either as for fun or they got injuries like in their early 20s, and then they started using kratom in their 30s, which is it's right. 26 in Malaysia, they said, on average age. People get older, they don't typically try new drugs that they're gonna form a habit with, and it's kind of like early 20s is experimental stage, but kratom is kind of like that. Just goes to show that people are trying it for sobriety.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, I noticed that as well. The mean age of first illicit drug use, 20.4. Mean age of first kratom use, 26.7. And also interesting in table 2 right below that, mean duration is 93.7 months, which is essentially 8 years, 7.8 years. I see a lot on the kratom subreddits, and it's kind of cool when you see, there are people that are like, you've been using kratom for 4 years, went to the doctor and got my, blood panel done, everything looks good. But you see a lot of people who are concerned about, long-term use, but really in the studies that we're seeing come out now, 8 years of use. I mean, that's a long time. And we're not seeing these people croak over because their liver failed, at an epidemic proportion, right? It just doesn't happen. So there's some data to support long-term use is a more healthy alternative than continuing to grapple with the addiction. The other interesting thing is, they did the sociological study, but then they also collected samples of the kratom tea from the area in which the survey participants were found. So it looks like in some of these images, it looks like they essentially take the kratom leaves, put them in a boiling pot of water. They end up with this tea compound. So he wanted to look at what is the concentration of Mitragyna 7-hydroxy and then the two other related compounds in the kratom tea. And it looks like they freeze-dried the kratom tea to remove the water. They kept it at -20. Then they did ultra-pressure liquid chromatography with 2 mass specs, so MSMS. 300 milliliters of the kratom tea was equivalent to taking approximately 56.7 milligrams of Mitragyna.
And that was 3 times a day, too. I think it was like 900 milliliters a day.
And so, I think that's where I got the 150 milligrams proposal. But, it's interesting because I think I have seen other studies that sort of put the target range of that molecule for opiate addiction or coming off of opiate addiction around like 75 to 175 milligrams. And more often than not, I'm seeing now kratom products that have the alkaloid content written on the labels. And I mean, the AKA with their Kratom Protection Act is sort of mandating that information be put on consumer kratom products in the U.S. And in my perspective, that's only helpful for people who are trying to use kratom in a responsible way, because they can actually know how much they're taking and then, how often they're taking it and monitor use. And if that number gets too high, they could say, look, I gotta back off a little bit here for my own good, right? I've already seen what opiate addiction or withdrawal looks like. I don't want to go there. So I better not get too wild. And so it's another good thing that AKA is doing, American Kratom Association, in trying to provide elements that inform consumers. So informed consumption, in my book, is always better than a black market, type of situation. Yeah. And it's all batch specific. I mean, it would have to be tested in a way analogous to most medical cannabis programs, where like every harvest, or depending on which farmer or cultivation operation it's coming from, you have to test the batches. And so I wonder on that, like for companies that are mass producing different Kratom products, they do have the content on there. I'm happy to see that. There are some that have a QR code that allows you to go to a certificate of analysis from a lab, but we're getting there, and the AKA is pushing things in the right direction.
All right, that was Kratom Science Journal Club. We're going to try to do this every other week with Dr. Jonathan Cachat. The music is Captain Big Wheel, and the song is called Moonrunner. That's my old band. For more information on all things Kratom, see kratomscience.com. Take care.